Let's just dive right into this explainer, because today we are unpacking an absolutely epic, true underdog story. You know, history usually hands us tales of kings who were just born into power, right? Destined for the throne from day one. But what we're looking at today is a stunning historical anomaly. We've got this piece of history from the 5th century, and honestly, it reads way more like a high-stakes Hollywood action drama than some dry historical record. It's the incredibly cinematic story of an ancient scholar who literally traded his books for a battlefield.
So, let me ask you a question. Have you ever been so immensely frustrated with your education, like the bureaucracy, the unfairness, the systemic hurdles, that you just decided to overthrow the local government? Okay, it sounds like a movie plot, right? The kind of revenge fantasy we might joke about after a really brutal exam. But today, we're looking at hard, undeniable epigraphic evidence of a student who actually pulled it off. His name was Mayurasharman, and the true story of how he went from a dedicated scholar priest to founding a mighty ancient dynasty is just absolutely fascinating.
Part 1. The Ancient City of Learning. Before we can truly appreciate the incredible transformation of our protagonist, we really need to set the scene. To understand Mayurasharman's world, we first have to grasp the concept of a Ghatika. Now, in ancient times, these Ghatikas were the ultimate, unmatched centers of higher learning. We're talking about advanced, residential, educational institutions housing hundreds, sometimes even thousands of students who are entirely dedicated to studying the scriptures. The word itself actually comes from a root meaning to strive after a higher knowledge. But there's a catch. They were heavily supported by massive royal grants, meaning their funding came directly from the state. And as we're going to see, relying on state funding to maintain an academic sanctuary, yeah, that can become a very dangerous double-edged sword.
And the most famous, the most prestigious of these institutions was the Kanchi Ghatika, located in the great city of Kanchipuram. At the time, Kanchipuram was the capital of the mighty Pallava kings, serving as the absolute intellectual crossroads of South India. Honestly, you can just think of it as the Ivy League of the ancient world. It was this rigorous academic powerhouse that attracted brilliant minds from all across the subcontinent. They all converged in this one place, seeking absolute perfection in Vedic studies and the ancillary scriptures. To study there literally meant you were among the absolute elite of the intellectual class.
Part 2. A Scholar at Kanchi Ghatika.
So, enter our protagonist. Mayurasharman's origins perfectly set him up for a life of quiet contemplation. He was born to a Brahmin family deeply devoted to Vedic studies and the meticulous performance of ancient sacrifices. They were super proud of their heritage, tracing their lineage back to the revered Rishi Harit and the Manavya Gotra. In fact, there's this beautiful, incredibly specific detail preserved in the historical record. His family actually got their distinct name from a sacred Kadamba tree that grew right near their home, a tree they carefully and lovingly tended to for generations. Mayurasharman was a dedicated scholar priest to his absolute core. So, accompanied by his esteemed guru, who actually happened to be his grandfather, Veerasharman, he made this massive journey from his rural home to Kanchipuram. He entered the great Ghatika as a humble mendicant, willingly giving up worldly comforts to seek absolute perfection in holiness and education.
Part 3. The Spark of Rebellion. Okay, but here's where things get tense. The educational system in Kanchi, for all its prestige and brilliance, had a fundamental, critical flaw. The scholar's very existence relied entirely on the whims and the patronage of the ruling martial class. You had this massive, systemic power imbalance that was effectively a cultural powder keg. On one hand, you had the highly educated, twice-born Brahmins within the Ghatika, whose entire existence was dedicated to seeking knowledge, spiritual purity, and performing rigorous sacrifices. Yet, physically and administratively, they were completely subjugated by the Kshatriya Pallava kings and their heavily armed military guards, who wielded raw, unchecked state power. The tension between these two worlds, the quiet purity of the scholar versus the martial arrogance of the state, was palpable. And this underlying tension finally boiled over when Mayurasharman got into a fierce, deeply humiliating quarrel with the Pallava horseman over the royal stables.
We actually have his recorded thoughts from this exact moment of sheer humiliation, miraculously preserved for centuries. He lamented, "Alas, that in this Kali Yuga, the Brahmins should be so much feebler than the Kshatriyas." Just take a second to imagine the profound weight of that realization for a dedicated scholar. He realized that it didn't matter how perfectly he studied his branch of the Veda. It didn't matter how devoutly he served as guru or how much spiritual perfection he attained. His ultimate success, his safety, and his very human dignity were entirely dependent on the fleeting mood of an arrogant king or a dismissive royal guard.
For Mayurasharman, that realization was absolutely intolerable.
So what does a scholar do when the system completely fails him? Faced with systemic disrespect and the painful reality that knowledge without power leaves you completely defenseless, Mayurasharma had to make an impossible choice. I mean, he could swallow his pride, submit to the Pallavas, and quietly return to his books. Or he could turn his back on his lifelong duty as a priest and forge an entirely new, incredibly dangerous path.
Part 4. Trading Scriptures for a Sword.
He chose the dangerous path. And guys, this triggered what has to be one of the most astonishing career changes in all of ancient history. He realized that to protect his dignity and his people, he needed raw, undeniable power. The historical record literally states that Mayurasharman abandoned his sacred kusha grass and ceremonial ladle, picked up a flaming sword, and set out to conquer the earth. The sheer audacity of this is just staggering. A peaceful, disciplined student dropping the tools of his lifelong spiritual duty to take up arms. He raised a rebel force, probably recruiting right out of the Ghatika itself, gathering up other frustrated, brilliant scholars who were finally just ready to fight back against their bullies. It is literally the ultimate ancient underdog story.
What followed was a brilliant, highly strategic guerrilla campaign. His intellect as a scholar translated perfectly into military tactics. First, he struck fast, overpowering the Pallava frontier guards. Then, knowing he couldn't face the main army head-on, he fled deep into the dense, incredibly rough forests of Sriparvata. From that impenetrable stronghold, he forced the neighboring Bana kings to pay him tribute, building up his resources. When the mighty Pallava army finally marched out like a massive ocean to swallow him whole, he absolutely refused to fight them on an open field. Instead, he ambushed them in the rough terrain at night, striking them, as the record beautifully states, like a hawk full of strength. He took his strategic genius and absolutely humbled the greatest military machine of his region.
Part 5. Founding the Kadamba Dynasty. The mighty Pallava kings, battered and outsmarted in the forests, quickly realized a hard truth. They simply could not defeat this scholar-turned-general in battle. So, in one of the greatest, most ironic twists in historical records, the Pallavas actually sued for peace. Recognizing his sheer tactical brilliance, they ended up employing Mayurasharman as a general in their own armies. Think about that irony for a second. The exact same empire that insulted him in the stables, treating him like a second-class citizen, was now entirely reliant on his military genius for their own strength and protection. Crazy, right?
But Mayurasharma wasn't done yet. Serving as a general for his former bullies, that was just a stepping stone. Eventually, waiting for the absolute perfect circumstances, he cast off the yoke of Pallava rule entirely. He stepped out of their shadow and crowned himself an independent monarch. Crowned, as the ancient texts proudly say, by the god of war, Skanda himself. From a bullied student, he became the formidable lord of Banavasi, founded the mighty Kadamba Dynasty, and ruled over vast prosperous lands stretching all the way to the Western Ocean. He forever altered the political and cultural landscape of southern India.
Part 6. The Talagunda Pillar Inscription.
Now, you might be listening to this and thinking, okay, this sounds way too cinematic to be real. It has to be a myth. But we have undeniable proof. The story of Mayurasharman's incredible life is preserved as a primary source document, literally set in stone. The evidence is engraved on a massive, hard gray granite pillar definitively dated between 455 and 470 CE. This incredible artifact is located at the Pranavalingeswara temple in Talagunda, Karnataka. It was carefully commissioned by Mayurasharman's own descendant, King Santivarman, to honor his lineage. And what makes it so breathtaking is that it was composed in wonderful classical Sanskrit by the court poet Kubja. It's just incredibly rare to have such a detailed, beautifully composed, and deeply personal origin story surviving intact from the 5th century.
Beyond just telling a legendary biography, this artifact is absolutely crucial for our broader understanding of history. It remains one of the earliest, most solid pieces of evidence confirming Kanchipuram's historical role as an elite center of higher learning. It proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that ancient Ghatikas were highly organized, deeply influential institutions where people traveled vast, incredibly difficult distances just to study, debate, and seek knowledge.
As we wrap up this explainer, I really want to leave you with a provocative thought. How much of our global history is shaped not by grand, sweeping, inevitable designs, but by a single, isolated moment of personal disrespect? It really leaves you wondering about the butterfly effect, doesn't it? If that Pallava guard had just been polite, if he hadn't insulted a proud, dedicated scholar over some horses, would Mayurasharma have just quietly finished his studies and become an obscure priest? Would the mighty Kadamba Dynasty, which totally shaped the history of southern India, even exist? Would the map of the ancient Indian world look entirely different today? It's a fascinating, lingering reminder of the sheer power of a single moment. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive into the Talagunda inscription, and I hope this sparks your curiosity to keep learning.